Hello and welcome. This is something of an unusual departure for this channel, as I'm going to look at a book today. Douglas Murray has just released his latest book, War on the West. And it seemed to me that behind Murray's excellent analysis there was a Christian or a spiritual understanding or interpretation that we needed to try and pull to the surface. So if you don't have time to get to the end, then what I'm going to do is to suggest that Douglas Murray's climax, which I don't think he makes enough of, arises when he compares some words of Nietzsche and an insight of Dostoevsky, and says that justice is in fact a desire for revenge masquerading as justice, and that the real resentment is against a spirit of gratitude. So we'll develop what this means spiritually in time. But first of all, let's look at the arguments that Murray uses in his book. So this will act as a kind of as a brief synopsis if you haven't read it, and I hope as a highlighting of things that you may think are important with me if you have. Well, it begins with Murray explaining how we're in the grip of a mass psychosis. And he gives the example of a survey in America where people place themselves along a spectrum of libertarian consciousness. The people who thought themselves most liberal were asked a question. They were asked, how many unarmed black people do you think that the white police have killed this year? And the people who were furthest woke guesstimated the answer was about 10,000. And then the less woke reduced that number accordingly, but the real number was 10. Not only was the real number 10, but it turned out that black men had killed more policemen than policemen had killed black men. So the perception of real life that people had was highly distorted and constituted something of a madness. Murray explains something of those madnesses really quite powerfully and colourfully. He talks about the University of Indiana in about 2016, which was suddenly closed down immediately because someone contacted security and said there was a member of the Ku Klux Klan walking around with a whip. So security did a quick search, closed the place down, and they traced the figure who had been spotted and caused such intense racial hysterical alarm to a Catholic monk, a Dominican. They wear white habits. It wasn't a whip, it was a rosary. So we have to ask ourselves what kind of distortion of reality moves a Dominican monk into the imagination of a Ku Klux Klan member in the eyes of the beholder. Murray shows a number of utterly weird phenomena. He talks, for example, about a television program called Jeopardy. There was a man called Kelly Donahue. He won an episode. Now, in fact, he'd won two before. But on this one, he produced a figure. I guess it must have been something like this, perhaps, to the public, just briefly on the television. And he was immediately denounced for having made a secret sign of white supremacy. Nearly 600 previous contestants got so angry with him, they wrote a letter denouncing him and complaining. Kelly was aghast. He wasn't a white supremacist. He didn't know any white supremacists. And he tried to explain that this was the third time he'd won. And the first time he went, I've won one. And the second time he won two. And you can guess what he did for the third program, the third one he won. Now, interestingly enough, not everyone believed him. And the television company were excoriated by the woke for not having seen it themselves and cut this out. In Murray's book, he looks at race, history, religion, and culture. And he looks at each one of these to try and explain what he thinks is going on. The first chapter on race, of course, is definitive. And he starts with what CRT is, not so much a definition as a movement of revolt against whiteness. And Murray explains quite clearly that that if you're going to be against whiteness, that makes you racist. You cannot defend blackness by being against whiteness and then claim that you're non-racist. The moment you invoke colour like that, you've got a real problem. I think one of the things I want to mark here is something that I've thought for some time, and I'd be very happy in the comments if you can help me refine my view. But I don't think racism exists as such. And that doesn't mean that I don't think people don't behave in what we describe as racist ways. Of course they do. But the problem with racism as a theory is that you can't define it. So it's clearly based on skin colour, but skin colour is determined by melanin, and that's to do with gradated pigments in the skin going from pink through brown to what we might call yellow and white. But there are no categorical divisions that stop someone being white as you move through sunburnt or change melanin through brown to black. Nor is it the case that we can define race by DNA. We can't. As it happens, I know that I have 3 streams of racial ancestors. I have Saxons and Celts and Jews, more or less nearly 30% each, and a bit of Russian somewhere. But I'm a mixture of races, and it would be very surprising if everyone was not a mixture of races. In fact, the only thing that DNA really shows up is that there's just one branch of humanity who haven't interbred with Neanderthals, who have no Neanderthal DNA. The rest of us have some Neanderthal DNA. And they are the indigenous people of black South Africa. They're the only pure human beings. So it would have been wonderful to have told that to the Boers in the early part of the last century. But sadly, the DNA hadn't been discovered sufficiently in time. So if you can't define race, then what are you talking about? Well, obviously human beings have prejudice. Obviously they have dislike. Obviously we other each other. But if you can't define what race is, it's very difficult to know that you're guilty of racism. And so Christians, of course, have had a different standard by which to judge relationship with a neighbour. And it's simply talked of as loving your neighbour as yourself, which we get from our Jewish heritage. So the failure to love is a much more accurate descriptor of human failure than the thought crime of racism. We can see failure to love acted out. We can't look into other people's minds and judge what level of racist thought crime they've committed. It's a highly problematic sin, in other words, because you can't ever test it, which is why it's used so freely as a form of accusation. And in the end, you can find that, as we'll see later on, that even gardening becomes racist. Music becomes racist. So perhaps one of the first things we ought to do as Christians is say we refuse to use the term. It's not a mechanism we can use to judge worthy or unworthy human behaviour. Critical race theory, of course, is based upon a position which looks at all human relations through the prism of race and power. And that itself is enormously problematical because, again, we as Christians do not look at the race. We do not look at humanity through the prism of power. We look at it through the eyes of God, who is compassion and forgiveness. In other words, we assess people by the degree to which they aspire to and practice love. Well, the kind of charts or success rates you get, or the way the capacity to diagnose people is, it seems to me, far more benign if you use love and compassion, and falling away from love and compassion rather than the accusation of the misuse of power only. In fact, to see human relationships through the lens of power is to demean us all, simply and reduce us to pawns, almost as if life is simply a chess match where you outflank other people and you remove them in order to destroy them, dismiss them, and to win. But life as a racist chess match between white and black, with black being good and white being bad, is not an adequate way of describing human relations or human history or philosophy or culture. And the problem with using race as a way of determining justice and injustice is that it leaves out everything else. And in leaving out everything else, it gives a highly reduced series of criteria for the ways in which we assess human beings and our humanity. And so in Douglas Murray's chapter on history, he notes that the woke culture wars are attacking history and trying to rewrite it. You may not know that the United Kingdom spent more in putting down slavery and in reparations economically than the estimate is that was ever gained from the fruits of slavery. Now, you never hear that. In fact, the cost of reparations that was paid in paying off slave owners and companies that owned slaves wasn't finally paid until the 20th century. You never hear that our Navy was the only Navy that set aside part of itself to police and put down slavery. You'd think that instead of being attacked for colonialism, that the United Kingdom would get some credit for the cost and for the moral vigour of dealing with slavery. You'd never guess that white slaves formed as a large, significant part of the slave market in North Africa. The self-hatred that lies behind defining America as understood only in terms of the introduction of slaves could exclude all other categories and virtue. It becomes too narrow a lens to begin to assess everything. And yet, for some very strange reason, all of our institutions have begun to implement a racist way of assessing our history. Even the National Trust puts up trigger warnings on statues. At one point, the British Library, as Douglas Murray explains, looked at one of our artists and accused him and tried to get him cancelled because 4 centuries before he had an ancestor who had gained something by investing his money in a company that had something to do with slavery. As it happened, the ancestor was an uncle who had no descendants, and so the artist that in question wasn't even a direct descendant. And it was argued too that the ancestor in question hadn't even made any money. Rustat in Cambridge, who was an enormously generous philanthropist, was the subject of cancellation by Trinity College as they tried to get a memorial removed. It was only when those people defending him proved that he hadn't got any income from his investments in slavery, and so none of his money was tainted, that the effort to get him cancelled and thrown out began to fail. But the idea that the one unforgivable sin, the one blasphemy that can never be forgiven, is racism, mimics, of course, the Christian understanding that there is an unforgivable sin. In Christian terms, it's the sin against the Holy Spirit. It's calling evil good and good evil. And part of the problem is that critical race theory comes very close to the Christian definition of blasphemy by entirely obscuring good and evil in its effort to be enormously moral. A historical struggle seen through the eyes of supposedly anti-racist critical race theory only sees history in terms of the struggle between white people and black people. Well, there are a number of other ways of looking at history. I mean, one, of course, is the Whig theory, where all history is part of a general unfolding of unstoppable progress. The other is the great man theory, where you discover history being changed by extraordinary heroic figures of some intelligence, virtue and power. These have been the two essential categories of assessing history. The Christian view of seeing history itself is to do with whether or not nations and people invoke the Christian gospel in the way in which they have to do with each other. There's something very beautiful about the Middle Ages, where the Pope was able to say to Christian kings to forbid them to fight for 30% of the year on the grounds these were holy days, and no Christian king and no Christian soldiers should take the lives of other people on holy days. And suddenly all fighting was reduced by 30%, which is rather more civilized than the 24/7 fighting that we've done since the Middle Ages disappeared. So there we have four versions of history: the racial view, the Whig view, the great man view, and the Christian view. But the idea that CRT provides the only view is, of course, intellectually ludicrous and very unhelpful. Why is it that our whole culture seems to have sucked the wells of critical race theory dry and adopted the categories and the criteria? Well, Professor John McWhirter, who is a black professor of history in America, makes a very good case for saying that woke culture is essentially a new religion. And this is exactly where the Christian churches have begun to make a mistake. If you interpret the Lord's Prayer, "Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as in heaven," as a manifesto for a kind of utopianism, that we can get heaven made on earth, then you're very close indeed to secular socialist utopianism, where having rejected heaven, having rejected hell, having rejected God, utopian left-wingers do their very best to make heaven on earth. The problem is that as they've tried it, they've made hell on earth. And so the greatest and most effective socialist experiments, whether you see them as taking place in Russia under Stalin or China under Mao Zedong, culled something like 100 million people as the cost of forcing this utopianism. You'd think that by the end of the 20th century, people, having read their history, would have understood the human cost of forcing utopian reality, or attempts at making utopian reality, on people, but not so. And to the extent that Christian churches lose their longing for heaven, their sense of heaven, their grasping of the reality of hell, it then becomes, as they become metaphysically weaker, it becomes easier to become politically more ambitious. And I think you can make a sliding scale between a metaphysical awareness of heaven and hell and the importance of salvation, and at the other end, making the kingdom of heaven come on earth in political and social terms. And as many of the Christian churches have lost their vision of heaven and hell and the reality of salvation, the reality of the struggle between good and evil, and of a real devil, so they found themselves taking refuge in the political alternative to that, which is very close to utopianism. But where they haven't, you still have this new movement fulfilling the function of a religion. It's exactly as Chesterton said: if you take away belief in God, people won't disbelieve, they'll believe in anything. And the diagnosis of the 19th century, which was, if you can get rid of the illusions of religion, we'll simply have rational progress, has again proved to be woefully mistaken. The opposite's happened. McWhirter begins to explain how wokeism, and particularly critical race theory, begins to approach the categories of a replacement Christianity. So whereas Christians have original sin, the disobedience that drove us out of the garden and diminished God's protection, original sin in wokeism and critical race theory is, of course, white privilege. And where we have a judgment day where we are all held to account by Christ, Pantocrator, instead critical race theory has the day when people are held to account for their racism. And for us, there was an excommunication of heretics, people being displaced from Christian community. And the woke version of that is, of course, cancellation. In Christianity, you can be forgiven. There is forgiveness. The terrifying thing in woke theory is that there is no forgiveness. You can be cancelled for a single mistake, and forever there is no redemption. There is no coming back. In Christianity, the metaphysical struggle is good against evil. In wokery, it's black against white. We have sin, which is disobedience to God, and wokery has thought crime, particularly as it relates to racism or the abuse of power. They've even begun to borrow our liturgy. In our liturgy, we have a number of important movements. One is genuflection before the altar and the Blessed Sacrament. It came as no surprise at all that Black Lives Matter borrowed genuflection and instead had it as a taking of the knee, an acknowledgement of the abuse of white people and the importance of black power, and effectively black revenge. Much of this is based philosophically on the same platform that the left have used to understand human relations, looking particularly at Rousseau and his idea that human beings were born with a blank slate and that indigenous communities were in fact paradisal communities with no sin at all. And that feeds in very nicely to the idea that if things are wrong in society, it must be because white people who are not part of this vision of indigenous, primitive, perfect people, white people have introduced racial injustice. And so the only way back to the Eden of Rousseau is to restrain, tame, punish, and exculpate white people. And once again, salvation is seen as the racist expulsion of whites. Instead of being saved from moral condemnation and moral assessment for our weaknesses and our rebellion, because the love of Christ has borne the price for us on the cross. Same categories, different analysis of vice, different solution. This reading of history has led to a huge assault on our culture. The problem is that our culture is the fruit of Judeo-Christian insight, whether it's the rule of law or the equality of people before the law, our pursuit of justice, the evolution of human rights. All, and above all, freedom of speech, all these things emerged from a coalition of the Judeo-Christian tradition with the great advances of the 18th and 19th century, technologically and scientifically, and ought to go hand in hand. But there is instead a great assault on our culture, an assault on the virtues of Shakespeare, on music, even on gardening. And so Q produces trigger warnings about the gathering together as a scientific experiment of the great horticultural explorations through the world, where white technology sought to catalogue and understand and improve and defend and mend the very best throughout the world. As Murray says, if you want to go for a scientific discovery or for the panacea of a disease, you go to white technology. You don't go to the indigenous black or brown tribes. Now, this is Murray throwing back racism in the face of CRT. But actually, one of the things he's trying to do is to take a sober assessment of the virtues of a culture that happened to be white. And this is not necessarily to say that whiteness is better, and certainly not to say that white people are better. In fact, one of the ways as Christians we get rid of that is we simply refuse to deal in the categories of colour and race. They're of no interest to us, because all we are interested in doing is dealing in the virtues and vices of each human being as we are accountable to God. And we're very sensitive about dealing with the collective, because the collective doesn't tell the truth about the moral struggle for the salvation of each soul. One of the things that Murray does that's very important is that he goes to Nietzsche, and he sees in Nietzsche the analysis that justice that revenge masquerades itself as justice, and that the evil that's coming out of the woke movement is being fueled by resentment. A resentment that says, I'm hurting, something's wrong, somebody else must be to blame, and it's not me. Resentment conceals its demand that somebody else must be punished in its quest for equality, because it seeks to punish people who are not equal and to reduce them to the lowest common denominator. It wants nothing less than the destruction of all those who embody higher values. The other thing that Murray does is to go to Dostoevsky and he notices that in the Brothers Karamazov, Dostoevsky has one of his characters say, in fact it's the devil himself, say that the one characteristic that he's entirely not allowed, the one virtue entirely forbidden to evil, is gratitude. And so Murray begins to suggest that we do have, of course, these conflicts as they've been exemplified throughout the book. But right behind it is a moral conflict between resentment and vengeance and gratitude. So now as Christians, we reject the false religion of wokeism. We want to keep to the categories that of sin and salvation as they've been explained and lived out in Christianity, particularly as they've been lived out. And in terms of spiritual discernment, we notice that there's something profoundly corrupt, very disturbing, and even evil in the movement of wokery as it tries to impose its own utopian solution on society by getting rid of Judeo-Christian culture and Judeo-Christian history. In other words, what we see is a struggle of good against evil. Good and evil expressing themselves not with black, whatever that is, being good, and white, whatever that is, being evil. We understand the struggle between good and evil, between God and rebellion against God. We understand it not in terms of collective political categories where people once making a mistake can never be forgiven. We understand it instead in terms of the quest for human virtue and the accountability of each person. Essentially, this begins to look like a struggle against Christianity. Other religions, non-Judeo-Christian cultures, are let entirely off the hook. You hear nothing about the racism of China. You hear nothing about Chinese colonialism. It's all aimed at the West, and the West was built on Christian values, Christian language, Christian categories. One of the interesting developments is the way in which critical race theory, Black Lives Matter, wokery, are attacking the Enlightenment as well. And this is almost certainly because values of the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution, where wokery claims there are different ways of knowing, not liking mathematics, not liking efficiency, not liking the scales of measurement, where it begins to become clear that the danger of the Enlightenment is that it operates criteria of assessment that Black Lives Matter fails, testing theories to see whether they're true or not. And because we're faced with something that's masquerading all the time, masquerading resentment and anger, masquerading as justice instead of revenge, so many of the values that this new religion pretends to endorse are also masquerading. Equality, of course, is masquerading as getting rid of anything that criticizes the utopian system. Diversity is masquerading as inclusion, so long as it's not white and Christian. As it happens, two particular servants of the Enlightenment, Murray and Peterson, have come to the aid of the church. The church seems to have lost its courage. It seems to have been secularized and therefore made open to the corruption and the distortions of this new culture. And so we should be very grateful to Douglas Murray and Jordan Peterson for reminding us, for stripping away the fakery and the masquerading and the pretending, and to remind us of the importance of our heritage. But neither Murray nor Peterson can fight the spiritual war that we have here. The spiritual war of good against evil is fought by using all the spiritual armory, the armory of spiritual warfare that St. Paul tells us about. The quest for salvation, the binding and the disempowering of evil that our Lord calls us to. The only way this can be won is through the virtues of the Christian struggle to convert human beings and to convert society. We should be extremely grateful for Douglas Murray and Jordan Peterson for exposing the vacuity, the lies, the distortion and the masquerading of these alternative movements. But we should understand that they are false and competitive religions, and that this is a fight not only between life and death, between freedom and captivity, but between heaven and hell, between salvation and damnation. It's time the church got its act together, saw more clearly, used its own categories of discernment with more confidence, and began to take up the fight in terms that we know that it should be engaged in. Thank you, Douglas Murray. Thank you, Jordan Peterson. All praise to our Lord Jesus Christ, who gains us the victory over evil, now and unto the ages of ages. Amen.